In September of 1941, Japan implemented its kill all, burn all, destroy all campaigns, devastating entire regions with destruction and hunger. In China, the nationalists achieved a significant victory at the Jin River, even as tensions escalated with the communists due to the new Fourth Army crisis. Soviet influence strengthened in Xinjiang with cautious resumption of aid, while Chongqing faced relentless air assaults. The front lines buckled in Hunan and southern Shanxi with the catastrophe at Zhongyuan, renewed attacks on Changsha, and a near breakdown at Yichang before assistance arrived. Meanwhile, the United States brought in Chennault's Flying Tigers, the British tested guerrilla support, and Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union altered the dynamics for everyone involved. This narrative follows the Chinese conflict through these tumultuous events, revealing the pressures on strategy, the political complexities at every turn, and the harsh toll endured by both soldiers and civilians in 1941. At the start of 1941, the outlook was more favorable for the Chinese nationalists. The Japanese 11th Army was so dispersed that it struggled to launch a cohesive offensive. South of the Yangtze River, the nationalists dealt a heavy blow to the 33rd and 34th Divisions at the Jin River, inflicting around 15,000 Japanese casualties. In a strategic gamble, Chiang Kai-shek compelled the Communist New Fourth Army to vacate their positions south of the Yangtze and retreat north of the Yellow River. Although an agreement facilitated this withdrawal, Mao Zedong ensured its failure. Intense clashes erupted when Communist troops, intentionally misled by Mao, mistakenly engaged with nationalist forces. Naturally, narratives of the events varied widely from both sides. What remains clear is that this incident made a future civil war increasingly unavoidable. Soviet representatives limited their comments to expressing concern about the nationalists and communists fighting one another instead of focusing on the Japanese threat. In the broader context, international communist parties used the incident as propaganda, portraying the nationalists as the perpetual aggressors. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek was infuriated by the expanding Soviet influence over the northwestern province of Xinjiang, which bordered Mongolia, the Soviet Union, and India. Through the local warlord, Sheng Shitsai, the Soviet Union established bases and factories, set up a military garrison, and began mining for tin and drilling for oil. They also operated a secret camp training members for the Chinese Communist Party as their influence expanded in the province. Sheng Shitsai even sought membership in the Chinese Communist Party, a request that Stalin denied, leading to his acceptance into the Communist Party of the Soviet Union instead. Since Xinjiang was a crucial point for supplies and trade with the Soviet Union, the nationalists found themselves constrained. Chiang Kai-shek had no choice but to wait for a more opportune time to regain control over what had turned into a Soviet stronghold. Despite these tensions, Soviet supplies resumed for now, largely because Stalin feared a renewed Japanese threat in the Far East. In southern Hunan province, the nationalists again employed their strategy of retreat, followed by counterattack. The Japanese managed significant advances only in southern Shensi, capturing vital agricultural regions that the nationalists relied on for sustenance and recruitment. This occurred after their decisive win in the Battle of Zhongyuan, which Chiang Kai-shek referred to as the greatest shame in the history of the Japanese War. During this period, Ernest Hemingway and his new wife, Martha Gellhorn, were traveling in China, and the surrounding misery deeply affected even the fearless Gellhorn. She wrote to her mother, "China has cured me. I never want to travel again. The real life of the East is agony to watch and horror to share." The dirt, odors, rats, and bedbugs took their toll. In the nationalist capital of Chongqing, which Hemingway described as gray, shapeless, muddy, and filled with drab buildings and poor shacks, they lunched with Madame Chiang Kai-shek and the Generalissimo. They were later informed that it was a great honor to be received by him without his dentures. The Generalissimo would not have been pleased to discover that Gellhorn had been captivated by the communist representative in Chongqing, Zhou Enlai. Hemingway, meanwhile, demonstrated that he was not as uncritical of the communists as he had been in Spain. He recognized the impact of their propaganda and how supporters of communism, like Edgar Snow, managed to convince readers in the United States that Mao's forces were fiercely fighting, while the corrupt nationalists were largely inactive, when in reality, it was the opposite. Corruption did exist in nationalist China, but it differed from one military unit to another and from officer to officer. Some old-fashioned staff officers in the 50th Army exploited military trucks to transport opium from Shekuan to sell in the Yangtze Valley. Yet not all nationalist officers engaged in such traditional warlord behavior. While some unscrupulously profited from the theft and sale of their soldiers' rations, others, more modern and progressive, personally funded medical supplies for their troops. The communists soon showed they were no better. Their production and distribution of opium aimed to create a war chest for future battles against the nationalists. In 1943, the Soviet ambassador estimated the communist sales of opium at 44,760 kilograms, valued at $60 million at that time. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 had a complex impact from the nationalist perspective. On the one hand, it meant that Stalin could not be as aggressive in his aim to seize control of the province of Xinjiang. More importantly, it clarified the alliances of the Second World War, aligning Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union against Germany and Japan. On the flip side, it made Stalin even more intent on evading conflict with Japan. Concerned about a potential increase in Japanese forces in the north, Stalin urged the Chinese communists to carry out major guerrilla attacks, but Mao, while agreeing in principle, took no action. The only major communist offensive, Operation 100 Regiments, had occurred the previous summer. Mao was infuriated because it had benefited the nationalists during a critical time, and although it inflicted significant damage to railways and mines, communist losses were severe. Despite the retreat to a position of internal neutrality by communist forces in 1941, Japanese Commander General Okamura Yasuji initiated brutal three-all anti-partisan campaigns, kill all, burn all, destroy all, aimed at communist bases. Young men, if they survived, were taken for forced labor, and starvation became a tactic as the Japanese destroyed all harvests they could not seize for themselves. During this time, it is estimated that the population of communist strongholds decreased significantly, dropping from 44 million to 25 million. This situation infuriated Moscow, as Mao decided to withdraw many of his troops and disperse those who remained behind Japanese lines. From the Soviet perspective, this act was seen as a betrayal of the principle of proletarian internationalism, which held that communists everywhere should make any sacrifice for the motherland of the oppressed. Stalin realized that Mao was more focused on taking land from the nationalists than on combating the Japanese. Additionally, Mao was working hard to diminish Soviet influence within the Chinese Communist Party. Although Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact with Japan in April and had stopped sending military supplies to the nationalists, he continued to provide them with military advisors. The main advisor at that time was General Vasily Chuikov, who later commanded the 62nd Army during the defense of Stalingrad. In total, around 1,500 Red Army officers had been in China, gaining experience and evaluating weapon systems, much like they had in the Spanish Civil War. The British also offered arms and training for Chinese guerrilla units. This assistance was organized by the Special Operations Executive Office in Hong Kong, but when its officers began supplying arms to communist groups in the East River area, Chiang demanded that the initiative be halted. Meanwhile, the Americans started providing support as well. This included the establishment of the American Volunteer Group, known as the Flying Tigers, led by retired United States Army Air Corps officer Claire Chennault, who also served as Chiang Kai-shek's aviation advisor and was equipped with 100 Curtiss P-40s. They were stationed in Burma to help safeguard the road to southwest China, although the P-40 struggled against the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero unless pilots employed specific tactics. Over China, particularly in the capital of Chongqing, pilots from the small nationalist air force did their best to disrupt the formations of Japanese bombers. By December 1938, Imperial General Headquarters had to acknowledge that nationalist Chinese tactics had thwarted their hopes for a swift victory. Consequently, they turned to strategic bombing in an attempt to break the Chinese will to resist. All industrial targets were aimed at, but the primary focus was the relentless bombardment of the nationalist capital, which was subjected to continuous, high-explosive and incendiary attacks. The Japanese implemented a strategy of numerous small attacks to keep the city in a constant state of alert and to weaken its air defenses. Chinese historians refer to this period as the Great Bombing of Chungking, with its most intense phase lasting from January 1939 until December 1941, when Japanese naval aviation units were reassigned to the Pacific. Over 15,000 Chinese civilians lost their lives and 20,000 suffered severe injuries. On September 18, 1941, the Japanese 11th Army initiated a new offensive against the strategically significant city of Changsha, deploying 4 divisions. The fighting was fierce as Chinese forces were compelled to retreat. As always, the wounded bore the brunt of this withdrawal. A Chinese doctor from Trinidad in the West Indies recounted a scene that was tragically typical. He described a Red Cross ambulance on the road, surrounded by hundreds of injured men who were either standing or lying down. The vehicle was full, and the lightly wounded had climbed onto the roof while some squeezed into the driver's seat. The driver stood in front of them, arms raised in desperation. This scene was not uncommon, as wounded men would lie on the road to prevent trucks from leaving without them. During this renewed effort to encircle Changsha, the Japanese unexpectedly faced more casualties than they inflicted. The combination of conventional and semi-guerrilla tactics employed by the nationalists was becoming increasingly effective, a strategy conceived by General Chuikov. Once again, the Chinese launched a counterattack just as the Japanese occupied the city. Japanese sources reported that they retreated only due to orders from Imperial General Headquarters, while the Chinese celebrated a significant victory. Meanwhile, the Chinese had mobilized a large force against the vital Yangtze River port of Ichang in an effort to reclaim it. On October 10th, they came close to overwhelming the Japanese 13th Division stationed there. The situation for the division became so dire that its staff contemplated burning regimental flags, destroying confidential documents, and even committing suicide. Yet, they were rescued just in time by the arrival of the 39th Division. Both the nationalist forces and their warlord allies, along with Chinese communists, deliberately engaged in a prolonged and geographically expansive campaign, avoiding major offensives. At times, both the nationalists and especially the communists sought local truces with the Japanese. The Imperial Japanese Army viewed operations in China as a way to train newly formed units. While China's ongoing resistance did not change the war's outcome in the Far East, it had significant indirect effects. By the time the Japanese launched their broader campaign in the Pacific in December 1941, their China Expeditionary Army remained at a formidable strength of 680,000. This figure was 4 times the number of Japanese ground forces deployed against British, Dutch, and United States territories. Several historians have noted that the funds and resources spent on the Sino-Japanese War since 1937 could have been far more effectively utilized in preparing for the Pacific War, particularly for building additional aircraft carriers. However, the most critical impact of Chinese resistance, along with the Soviet victory at Khalkhin Gol, was Japan's decision not to attack Siberia when the Red Army was at its most vulnerable in late 1941. The trajectory of the Second World War could have been significantly altered had such an assault occurred. In February 1942, General Marshall appointed Major General Joseph Stilwell as the United States commander in China and Burma. Stilwell had served as the United States military attaché in Nanking with the nationalist government since the start of the War of Resistance against Japan in 1937, earning him a reputation as an expert on China in Washington. Yet, Vinegar Joe Stilwell held a negative perception of Chinese officers, seeing them as lazy, duplicitous, and corrupt, among other criticisms. His perspective largely echoed the 19th century view that saw China as the sick man of Asia. He appeared to misunderstand the significant challenges facing Chiang Kai-shek's regime, including food supply issues that led to the withdrawal of troops to more fertile areas to prevent desertions due to hunger. Food was the nationalists' primary concern, especially as their regions became inundated with over 50 million refugees fleeing Japanese brutality. Following poor harvests and loss of farmland to the enemy, food prices soared. The impoverished and refugees faced starvation, with even lower-level officials struggling to provide for their families. The government struggled to stop speculators and military officers from hoarding grain and rice to sell at a higher price later, even as some of their stored supplies spoiled. The corruption that Stilwell criticized was very difficult to address. The nationalists' answer was to impose taxes on the peasantry in kind, which only shifted the responsibility of feeding large armies onto the farmers, who were also conscripted in significant numbers for labor. As a result, famine soon struck many areas. Recruitment became more challenging, forcing recruiters to use coercion and disregard exemptions. Rations were frequently lowered, and by the end of the war, the pay for a soldier for an entire month was less than the price of 2 cabbages. An agricultural society that had suffered extensive damage and communication breakdowns found it nearly impossible to conduct a modern war. The communists fared better in their less populated regions by enforcing strict controls at every level. They also effectively utilized labor and brought in their soldiers to assist with the harvest. The communist forces established their own farms to achieve self-sufficiency, which helped them gain greater support from impoverished peasants compared to the nationalists. Their significant advantage was a relative lack of disturbance, while the Japanese directed their efforts against the nationalists. Marshall had chosen Stilwell because of his strong commitment to the United States Army doctrine that stressed the importance of offensive strategies. However, the nationalists and their allied forces simply were not able to mount effective operations. They lacked the transportation needed to concentrate their troops, they were without air support, and they had no tanks. This is why Chiang Kai-shek determined, even before the war started, that their only chance for survival lay in a prolonged war of attrition. Chiang, a pragmatic leader who understood his country and the limitations of his military far better than Stilwell did, had to endure continuous criticism for lacking an offensive spirit. Stilwell disdainfully referred to the Generalissimo as Peanut. Fearing that the American public's frustration with Japan would lead to the United States making peace with Tokyo and potentially abandoning him, Chiang felt compelled to tolerate the disrespect from such an ungrateful ally in his urgent plea for assistance. Stilwell shared the widespread belief among Marshall and his supporters that the British were solely focused on reclaiming their empire and were willing to manipulate American support to achieve this goal. However, he stood alone in his conviction that the Japanese could be effectively defeated in China. This perspective sharply conflicted with Washington's strategy, which aimed to support Chiang Kai-shek in tying down significant Japanese forces in China, while the United States concentrated on gaining dominance in the Pacific. Marshall outright denied Stilwell's request for an American Army Corps to lead the efforts in China. Stilwell's focus on the importance of the conflict in China led him to shift his attention to Burma to secure the nationalist supply line. In contrast, the British viewed Chiang Kai-shek's forces as a means of defending India and later as partners to help them reclaim their lost territories in Burma and Malaya. Hong Kong presented a more complicated situation, as they knew Chiang was determined to reclaim it for China. Although Stilwell bore part of the responsibility for the problems in Burma, he was celebrated as a hero in the American media, which remained largely unaware of the situation in China. Until 1941, the nationalists had effectively managed the war by balancing rural economic needs with the conscription of 2 million men annually and ensuring they were fed. However, the Japanese offensive from southern Shensi took control of Ichang, a vital communications center on the Yangtze River, cutting off most nationalist armies from their food sources in Sichuan. Chiang Kai-shek was frustrated that Stilwell, after the lengthy withdrawal in Burma, had retreated to India in 1942 with 2 of his top divisions. He rightly suspected that Stilwell was attempting to establish his own independent command, but tolerated it because he was even more concerned about these divisions falling under British control. The 22nd and 38th Divisions were re-equipped with halted Lend-Lease supplies meant for Chiang's armies, which could no longer be delivered due to the loss of the Burma Road. The only way to bring in a limited amount of supplies was through transport planes flying over the Himalayas. Additionally, even more aid meant for the nationalists was either stored in the United States or diverted to the British. Stilwell's authority over Lend-Lease supplies inevitably created friction and distrust in his relationship with the Generalissimo, to whom he was meant to serve as chief of staff. Stilwell was convinced that as the provider of aid, he should leverage it to compel Chiang to follow orders. The war in the Pacific, focused on naval and aerial power to support amphibious assaults, contrasted sharply with the ground conflict on the mainland of China. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur had withheld most of his troops when the Japanese made initial landings on December 10, 1941, at the northern end of Luzon. He accurately predicted these incursions were mere distractions aimed at dividing his forces. 2 days later, Japanese troops landed again on the southeastern peninsula of Luzon. The substantial attack did not occur until December 22nd, when 43,000 soldiers from the 14th Army stormed beaches located 200 kilometers north of Manila. These two significant landings revealed the Imperial Japanese Army's plan to execute a pincer movement against the capital of the Philippines. While MacArthur theoretically commanded a force of 130,000 personnel, the majority were Philippine reserve units. He had only 31,000 American and Philippine soldiers he could truly rely on. The seasoned Japanese forces, equipped with armored units, quickly began pushing his troops back toward Manila Bay. MacArthur activated the established Contingency Plan Orange, which involved retreating his forces into the Bataan Peninsula on the western side of Manila Bay to hold their position there. The island of Corregidor, situated at the mouth of the bay, could oversee the entrance with its coastal artillery and defend the southeastern end of the 50-kilometer-long peninsula. Lacking adequate military transport for his southern forces, MacArthur seized Manila's brightly painted buses. On the evening of December 24th, along with President Manuel Quezon and his government, MacArthur departed the capital by steamer to establish his headquarters on the island stronghold of Corregidor, known as the Rock. Large oil reserves and supply depots around Manila and the naval yard were set ablaze, sending massive columns of dark smoke spiraling into the sky. The retreat of the 15,000 American and 65,000 Philippine soldiers to Bataan and the first defense line along the Pampanga River was carried out with considerable difficulty. Many of the Filipino reservists had managed to slip away and return home, but others took to the hills to engage in guerrilla warfare against the invaders. Across the bay from Bataan, the Japanese entered Manila on January 2, 1942. MacArthur faced a significant challenge in providing food for 80,000 soldiers and 26,000 civilian refugees on the peninsula, especially with the Japanese Navy imposing an effective blockade and achieving air superiority. The Japanese assaults began on January 9th. MacArthur's forces, stationed at the narrow point of the Bataan Peninsula, were separated by Mount Natib in the center. The thick jungle and ravines on the western side and the swamps on the eastern side, along Manila Bay, posed treacherous conditions in their own ways. Malaria and dengue fever devastated MacArthur's troops, who suffered from shortages of quinine and other medical supplies. Many were already weakened by dysentery, which the United States Marine Corps referred to as the Yangtze Rapids. MacArthur's primary error was dispersing his supplies rather than concentrating them at Bataan and Corregidor. After 2 weeks of fierce fighting, the Japanese broke through the mountainous center on January 22nd, forcing MacArthur's forces to retreat to another line halfway down the peninsula. His sick soldiers, with tattered uniforms and skin beginning to rot from the jungle and swamps, were already fatigued and severely weakened. A new threat emerged with 4 Japanese amphibious landings around the southwestern tip of the peninsula. These landings were contained and resisted with great difficulty, resulting in heavy casualties for both sides. The resilience of the American and Filipino troops had been so impactful, causing significant losses for the Japanese, that by mid-February, Lieutenant General Homa Masaharu withdrew his troops slightly to allow them to rest and await reinforcements. While the defenders felt a boost in morale and took the opportunity to strengthen their fortifications, the toll of illness and the realization that no external assistance would be forthcoming began to sink in. Many of the battling bastards of Bataan, as they referred to themselves, grew increasingly resentful at the thought of MacArthur urging them for more effort from the safety of the concrete tunnels on Corregidor. He became known as Dugout Doug. Although MacArthur wished to remain in the Philippines, he received direct orders from President Roosevelt to leave for Australia to prepare for a counteroffensive. On March 12th, Douglas MacArthur, accompanied by his family and staff, departed on a convoy of 4 fast patrol torpedo boats. Those who remained under the leadership of Major General Jonathan Wainwright understood that their situation was dire. Suffering from starvation and illness, fewer than a quarter were able to continue fighting. On the other hand, General Homa's forces had been bolstered with an additional 21,000 troops, aircraft, and artillery. On April 3rd, the Japanese launched another attack with overwhelming strength. The defense fell apart, and on April 9th, the troops on Bataan under Major General Edward King Jr. surrendered. Wainwright on Corregidor still resisted, but the island was relentlessly bombarded by aerial strikes, naval gunfire from the sea, and artillery from the land. On the night of May 5th, Japanese soldiers landed on the island, and the next day a devastated Wainwright had no choice but to surrender his remaining 13,000 men. Yet, the suffering for those defending both Bataan and Corregidor was far from over. While the conflict with Germany and the conflict with Japan were handled as distinct struggles, they influenced one another more profoundly than it might initially seem. The Soviet triumph at Khalkhin Gol in August 1939 not only played a role in Japan's decision to move south, thus bringing the United States into the war, but it also allowed Joseph Stalin to relocate his Siberian divisions westward to thwart Adolf Hitler's campaign to capture Moscow. The Nazi-Soviet pact, which came as a significant surprise to Japan, also had an impact on their strategic considerations. This issue was exacerbated by the remarkable lack of communication between Germany and Japan, who had only established their neutrality pact with Stalin 2 months before Hitler initiated his invasion of the Soviet Union. The faction in Tokyo advocating for a southern strike won out, not only over those intent on confronting the Soviet Union, but also against elements within the Imperial Japanese Army that preferred to conclude the conflict in China first. Regardless, the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact meant that the United States became the primary supplier for the Chinese nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek continued to urge President Franklin Roosevelt to apply pressure on Stalin to join the fight against Japan, but Roosevelt refused to negotiate regarding Lend-Lease. Stalin was firm that the Red Army could manage only one front at a time. Roosevelt's significantly increased support for Chiang Kai-shek in 1941 angered Tokyo, but it was Washington's choice to impose the oil embargo that the Japanese perceived as akin to a declaration of war. The idea that their actions were a response to the occupation of Indochina and a warning against further invasions did not align with their perspective, which was rooted in national pride. Due to their belief in superiority, Japanese militarists, similar to the Nazis, were unable to distinguish between cause and effect. It is perhaps not surprising that they were infuriated by the Atlantic Charter created by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, viewing it as an effort to force the Anglo-American model of democracy on the globe. They could have highlighted the contradiction of the British Empire advocating for self-determination, while their own vision of liberation through the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was much more oppressive. In reality, their Asian New Order bore a striking resemblance to the German counterpart, and their treatment of the Chinese mirrored the Nazi view towards Slavic people deemed inferior. Japan would not have dared to launch an attack on the United States if Adolf Hitler had not initiated the conflict in Europe and the Atlantic. A conflict on two fronts was their only opportunity against the naval strength of the United States and the British Empire. This prompted the Japanese to seek commitments from Nazi Germany in November 1941, asking them to declare war on the United States following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Joachim von Ribbentrop, likely still irritated by Japan's earlier refusal to comply with a German request to act against Vladivostok and Siberia, was initially non-committal. He remarked that Franklin Roosevelt was unpredictable, making it impossible to anticipate his actions. General Oshima Hiroshi, the Japanese ambassador, directly inquired about Germany's stance. Ribbentrop ultimately responded that if Japan entered the war against the United States, Germany would immediately join the conflict. He stated there was no possibility of Germany negotiating a separate peace with the United States under those circumstances, as the Führer was resolute on that issue. The Japanese had not informed Berlin of their intentions, so the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor caught them off guard, according to Joseph Goebbels. Adolf Hitler received the news with great delight, reasoning that the Japanese would divert American attention. Thus, the war in the Pacific would likely diminish the supply lines to the Soviet Union and Britain. He believed that the United States was bound to engage in the conflict against him soon, yet it would not be able to intervene in Europe until at least 1943. He was unaware of the Germany First strategy that the American and British military leaders had agreed upon. On December 11, 1941, the American chargé d'affaires in Berlin was called to the Wilhelmstrasse, where Ribbentrop announced the text of Nazi Germany's declaration of war against the United States. Later that day, amid cries of Sieg Heil from party members in the Reichstag, Hitler himself proclaimed that Germany and Italy were now at war with the United States, along with Japan, as part of the Tripartite Pact. This pact was meant as an alliance of mutual defense, meaning Germany was not obligated to assist Japan if Japan initiated any aggression. Given that German troops were retreating before Moscow, Hitler's declaration of war on the United States seemed extremely reckless, reflecting an overabundance of pride. Ribbentrop, likely repeating Hitler's sentiments, grandly stated that a great power does not allow war to be declared upon it, but instead declares war itself. However, Hitler had failed to consult the High Command and significant military leaders at Führer headquarters, such as General Alfred Jodl and General Walter Warlimont, who were troubled by the thoughtlessness of this decision. They knew Hitler had previously asserted that he did not want conflict with the United States until after defeating the Soviet Union. In an instant, Hitler's belief that a victory over the Soviet Union would pressure Britain into withdrawal was completely overturned. Germany now found itself facing a war on two fronts. The generals were worried by his apparent disregard for America's industrial strength, while many ordinary Germans began to dread a conflict that could last for years. Soldiers on the Eastern Front heard the announcement and tried to interpret it positively. A soldier in the 2nd Panzer Division wrote, recounting that they listened to the Führer's speech, an exceptional occurrence, and boasted of being just 12 kilometers from the Kremlin. He believed that the real world war had now begun and that it was inevitable. The central aspect of Hitler's rationale lay in the naval warfare. Roosevelt's increasingly assertive shoot-on-sight policy, which directed American warships to engage German submarines wherever they encountered them, along with the decision to provide escorts for convoys west of Iceland, began to shift the Battle of the Atlantic in favor of the Allies. Gross Admiral Raeder had been urging Hitler to permit his wolf packs to retaliate. Hitler, sharing Raeder's frustration, had refrained from taking action until the Japanese could occupy the United States Navy in the Pacific and formally agreed not to negotiate a separate peace with America. Now, the Western Atlantic and the entire North American coastline were positioned to become a free-fire zone in this torpedo conflict. To Hitler, this represented a potential method to weaken Britain, even before the conquest of the Soviet Union. Conter-Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, requested in September 1941 that Hitler give as much notice as possible regarding a declaration of war on the United States. He sought time to prepare his wolf packs to strike mercilessly at American shipping along the eastern coast while America was still unprepared. However, Hitler's abrupt decision came at a moment when no U-boats were available in the vicinity. His deep-seated anti-Semitic beliefs led him to view the United States as predominantly a Nordic nation controlled by Jewish warmongers, further convincing him that a showdown between his new order in Europe and America was unavoidable. Yet he underestimated how the attack on Pearl Harbor had united America more forcefully than Roosevelt could have imagined. The isolationist movement, championed by the slogan "America First," was completely silenced, and Hitler's declaration of war fell right into Roosevelt's plans. The president had not expected Congress to support his undeclared war in the Atlantic without it. That second week of December 1941 marked a definitive turning point in the war. Churchill, despite the dreadful news from Hong Kong and Malaya, realized that Britain could never be defeated. After hearing about Pearl Harbor, Churchill remarked that he went to bed and slept soundly, feeling saved and grateful. The repulse of German forces before Moscow also indicated that Hitler was unlikely to secure victory against his most formidable adversary on land. There was a brief lull in the Battle of the Atlantic, and even in North Africa, the news had turned positive, with Auchinleck's Crusader offensive pushing Erwin Rommel away from Cyrenaica. Fueled by this optimism, Winston Churchill set sail once again for the New World, this time aboard the battleship HMS Duke of York, the sister ship of the Prince of Wales. His meetings with Franklin D. Roosevelt and the American military leadership were codenamed Arcadia. As he crossed the Atlantic, Churchill refined his thoughts on the future conduct of the war, engaging in intense discussions with his chiefs of staff to shape British strategic planning. They agreed that no invasion of Northern Europe should occur until German industry, particularly aircraft production, had been significantly weakened by heavy bombings, a campaign they wanted the United States Army Air Forces to support. Allied forces were to land in North Africa in 1942 to help defeat Rommel and secure the Mediterranean. Following this, landings could be launched in 1943 in Sicily and Italy, or along locations on the northern European coastline. Churchill also acknowledged that the United States should respond to Japanese aggression with aircraft carriers. After a turbulent journey across rough seas, the Duke of York arrived in the United States on December 22nd. Greeted by Roosevelt, Churchill was accommodated in the White House, where he proved to be a demanding guest for the next 3 weeks. Yet he thrived in this environment, receiving an enthusiastic welcome when he spoke to Congress. The two leaders could not have been more different. Roosevelt was undeniably a great man, but while he skillfully employed charm and a facade of intimacy, he was fundamentally vain, detached, and calculating. Churchill, in contrast, was passionate, outspoken, sentimental, and unpredictable. His well-documented Black Dog periods of depression hint at a form of bipolar disorder. The starkest contrast between them lay in their views on empire. Churchill took pride in his lineage from the renowned Duke of Marlborough and remained a traditional imperialist, while Roosevelt saw such beliefs as not only outdated but also deeply misguided. Although Roosevelt professed to dislike realpolitik, he often demonstrated a willingness to manipulate smaller nations to achieve his goals. Anthony Eden, now back as Foreign Secretary, noted dryly the challenges of the triangular relationship with the Soviet Union, stating that United States policy tends to be excessively moral, especially where non-American interests are concerned. The British delegation found reassurance from the American military leaders that the strategy of prioritizing Germany was still in place. This decision was further shaped by shipping shortages, as each vessel could only manage 3 round trips a year to the Pacific Theater due to the vast distances. The shipping limitations also resulted in the buildup of American forces in Britain for a cross-channel invasion being slower than anticipated. This issue would only begin to improve once the Liberty Ship construction program was initiated, ramping up the production of transport vessels. With its own entry into the conflict, the United States was poised to be much more than simply the great arsenal of democracy. The Victory program, originally proposed by John Monnet, one of the few French figures that the American administration genuinely respected, was already in motion. Plans to expand United States forces to over 8 million men were underway, along with substantial projections for the armaments, aircraft, tanks, munitions, and ships required to defeat both Germany and Japan. American industry began shifting to full-scale war production, driving the budget to a staggering £150 billion. The scale of military aid became remarkable. As one general put it, the American army does not resolve its challenges, it overwhelms them. In addition, the Lend-Lease program for the Soviet Union received congressional approval in October, and the American Red Cross provided $5 million worth of medical supplies. President Roosevelt put significant pressure on the delivery of supplies to the Soviet Union. Conversely, Winston Churchill raised Stalin's suspicions by making grand promises of assistance that he later failed to fulfill. On March 11, 1942, Roosevelt expressed to Henry Morgenthau, his Secretary of the Treasury, that every commitment made by the British to the Soviets had fallen short. He acknowledged that the only reason the United States had maintained a strong rapport with the Soviets was because they had kept their promises. Roosevelt also wrote to Churchill, stating bluntly that he felt he could manage Stalin better than either the British Foreign Office or American State Department could, explaining that Stalin harbored disdain for their high-ranking officials, but seemed to trust him more, and he hoped that would continue. Roosevelt's overconfidence in his sway over Stalin became a significant risk, particularly toward the war's conclusion. Stalin aimed for recognition from Britain regarding the Soviet Union's claims to eastern Poland and the Baltic states, which had been occupied following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and he pressured Anthony Eden to comply. Initially, the British refused to address this blatant violation of the Atlantic Charter's commitment to self-determination. However, Winston Churchill, concerned that Stalin might seek a separate peace with Adolf Hitler, suggested to Roosevelt that they might need to consider acknowledging it. Roosevelt outright dismissed the idea. Ironically, it was Roosevelt who sowed the seeds of distrust with Stalin through an unfeasible promise. In April 1942, without fully understanding the implications, he promised the Soviet leader a second front later that year. General George Marshall was alarmed by Churchill's access to the president at the White House, aware of Roosevelt's tendency to shape policy without consulting his military advisors. His concern deepened in June 1942 when he learned, during another of Churchill's visits, that Roosevelt had approved Churchill's plan for landings in North Africa, known as Operation Gymnast, which many senior American officers regarded as a British strategy for preserving the empire. Churchill returned from the United States in high spirits, but soon found himself burdened by a new wave of setbacks. On the night of February 11, 1942, and the following day, the German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, made their channel dash from Brest back to their home waters, despite poor visibility. Various attempts by Royal Air Force bombers and Royal Navy motor torpedo boats along the route ended in failure. The nation was left frustrated and outraged, with a sense of defeatism spreading in many areas. Then, on February 15th, Singapore fell. British humiliation seemed total. Churchill, once celebrated as a wartime leader, now faced criticism from all directions, including from the press, Parliament, and the government of Australia. To complicate matters further, large gatherings began to call for a second front now to support the Soviet Union, the one offensive operation Churchill was unwilling to initiate. Yet at that moment, the greatest threat was independent of British military setbacks. The Kriegsmarine had recently updated its Enigma settings by adding an extra rotor. Bletchley Park found itself unable to decode any transmissions. Donitz's wolf packs, now fully deployed in the North Atlantic and along the North American coastline, began to inflict losses that fulfilled Hitler's ambitions. In total, 1,769 Allied ships and 90 neutral vessels were sunk in 1942. Following Churchill's optimism over America joining the war, Britain faced the dire threat of starvation and collapse if the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. Unsurprisingly, amidst the many challenges and humiliations he faced, Churchill envied Stalin's success in pushing back the Germans from Moscow. The Red Army's significant victory in the battle for Moscow that December was soon overshadowed by Stalin himself. On the evening of January 5, 1942, he called a meeting of the Stavka and the State Defense Committee at the Kremlin. The Soviet leader, consumed by a desire for revenge, convinced himself that the time was right for a broad offensive. The Germans were in disarray, unprepared for winter, and would not be ready to fend off a significant attack until spring. As he paced his office, pipe in hand, he pushed for a plan to launch large encirclement operations along the central front near Moscow, in the north around Leningrad to break the siege, and in the south against Manstein's forces in Crimea, in the Donbass, and to reclaim Kharkov. Zhukov, unaware of Stalin's orders to the Stavka, was alarmed. In a discussion with Stalin, he argued that the offensive should focus on the western axis near Moscow. The Red Army lacked enough reserves and supplies, particularly ammunition, for a full advance. Following the battle for Moscow, the armies involved had sustained heavy losses and were fatigued. Stalin listened but dismissed all of Zhukov's cautions, insisting, "Carry out your orders." The meeting concluded. Only later did Zhukov realize his concerns had been in vain. Detailed directives had already been issued to frontline commanders. The German army was indeed battered and suffering. Dressed in clothing taken from peasants, their frostbitten soldiers, sporting unkempt beards, peeling noses, and cheeks burned by the cold, were unrecognizable from the ones who had advanced east the previous summer, singing marching songs. German soldiers adapted local customs by severing the legs of the deceased to heat them over a fire, enabling them to remove the boots. Even wrapping their feet in cloth often did not prevent frostbite while on guard duty. Frostbitten limbs, if not treated promptly, quickly became gangrenous and required amputation. Overwhelmed by the high number of casualties, army surgeons in field hospitals discarded the severed hands and legs in piles outside on the snow. Nevertheless, the German army's ability to bounce back from setbacks was frequently underestimated. Just when discipline appeared to be faltering, it was swiftly restored. During the tumultuous retreat, officers formed Kampfgruppen that combined infantry, assault guns, pioneers, and a few tanks. By the first week of January, at Hitler's directive, villages had been fortified into strongholds. When the ground was too hard to dig trenches, they resorted to using explosives or artillery shells to create craters, while also making mortar pits and firing positions behind walls of packed snow and ice enhanced with logs. At times, they had to scrape away snow using the butts of their rifles. German soldiers still had not received winter uniforms. They hoped to take Soviet casualties like padded jackets before they solidified from the cold, but the severe frosts often made this impossible. Dysentery plagued nearly all soldiers, making the experience of having to remove their trousers in such temperatures even more challenging. Additionally, melting snow for hydration typically worsened their situation. Rokossovsky's 16th Army and General Andrei Vlasov's 20th Army launched assaults north of Moscow, and when a gap appeared, the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps pushed through, backed by tank and ski battalions. However, as General Zhukov had warned, the German forces were no longer in disarray. Soviet troops soon discovered that rather than encircling the Germans, they themselves were cut off. While some German units were surrounded, they held their ground, receiving supplies by air. The largest encirclement involved 6 German divisions encircled around Demyansk along the highway from Leningrad to Novgorod. Even further northwest, General Kirill Meretskov Volkov Front made another attempt to lift the siege of Leningrad, employing the 54th Army and the 2nd Shock Army. Stalin pressured him into an early assault with untrained troops and artillery lacking proper sights until General Voronov arrived with a much-needed supply. The 2nd Shock Army moved across the river Volkhov, quickly making its way into the German rear and threatening to encircle the German 18th Army. However, their progress was hampered by German counterattacks and harsh winter conditions. To make their way through the heavy snow, they formed groups of 15. The first group moved ahead, crushing the snow that, in certain areas, reached their waists. After 10 minutes, this front group shifted back, taking their place at the end of the line. Their movement became increasingly difficult, as they occasionally encountered half-frozen patches of marsh and streams concealed under a thin layer of ice. With their feet soaked and frozen, they experienced severe frostbite. Their malnourished horses were worn out, forcing them to transport their own ammunition and supplies. General Vlasov, who had recently been praised for his role in defending Moscow, was appointed by Joseph Stalin to lead the troops. Although he was promised reinforcements and supplies, none arrived until it was too late. While some ammunition was airdropped, most landed behind German lines. Vlasov's forces soon found themselves completely surrounded in the frigid marshes and birch forests. Meretskov alerted Stalin to the looming catastrophe. Shortly after the thaw in spring, the Second Shock Army had effectively been wiped out, losing around 60,000 men, with only 13,000 managing to escape. A bitter Vlasov was captured in July, and the Germans quickly convinced him to establish a Russian Liberation Army. Many of those who volunteered did so merely to avoid starvation in prisoner-of-war camps. Stalin's response to Vlasov's defection exposed his misguided obsessions stemming from the Great Terror and the purging of the Red Army, as he questioned his advisors about how they had overlooked Vlasov before the war. Stalin's representatives, including the ineffective Commissar Lev Meklis, relentlessly pressured frontline commanders, blaming them for every issue, despite the fact that the shortages of supplies and vehicles were not their fault. No one dared inform Stalin of the chaos caused by his overly ambitious plan, which even included efforts to retake Smolensk. German reinforcements rushed in from France were thrust into battle without winter equipment, while many Soviet divisions dwindled to barely 2,000 men each. The attempt to create a significant encirclement around Vyazma ended in failure. Zhukov even deployed part of the 4th Airborne Corps behind German lines, but the Luftwaffe retaliated against their airfields near Kaluga, which the Germans were familiar with, having only recently vacated them. Along the entire Eastern Front, from Leningrad to the Black Sea, German strongholds effectively thwarted any significant advancements. In the Crimea, Manstein contained a Soviet amphibious assault on the Kerch Peninsula that aimed to disrupt his siege of Sebastopol. The most critical moment occurred at Rzhev, where the German Ninth Army faced the threat of encirclement. General Walther Model, who quickly became one of Hitler's favorites due to his relentless drive, was dispatched to take charge. Model exhibited remarkable physical courage and, on various occasions, moral courage by confronting Hitler. He immediately initiated a counter-offensive that caught the Soviet forces off guard. This action not only stabilized the front, but also trapped the 29th Army. However, the encircled Red Army soldiers, aware of the grim fate awaiting them if captured by Model's forces, fought valiantly until the end. Another favorite of Hitler, Field Marshal von Reichenau, who had taken command of Army Group South after Rundstedt's dismissal, became a different kind of casualty. On January 12th, he went for a morning run near his headquarters in Poltava. At lunch, he felt unwell and suffered a heart attack. Hitler promptly ordered that Reichenau be flown back to Germany for treatment, but unfortunately, the field marshal passed away during the flight. Shortly before his death, Reichenau, whose 6th Army had aided the SS Sonderkommando in the Babi Yar massacre, had successfully convinced Hitler to appoint his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Friedrich Paulus, as commander of the 6th Army. The Germans also managed to resupply their encircled troops at Demyansk, Kulm, and Belyaev. The significant Demyansk pocket was sustained by a daily supply run of over 100 Junkers 52 transports. This achievement would have significant ramifications a year later, when Hermann Göring assured Hitler that he could sustain Paulus's 6th Army trapped around Stalingrad. However, while the German forces at Demyansk received adequate provisions to continue fighting, the Russian civilians within the encircled area were left to starve. Around Kursk, Timoshenko's troops succeeded in pushing the Germans back in fierce confrontations. The battlefields were left in a frozen tableau of death. A Red Army officer named Leonid Rabichev encountered a young girl, a telephone operator who had been hiding in the forest since the arrival of the Germans. She expressed her desire to join the army, so he instructed her to climb into the cart. A little further along, he witnessed a horrifying scene. An expansive area filled with tanks from both their side and the Germans stretched out to the horizon. In between were thousands of Russians and Germans, some seated, some standing, and some crawling, all frozen in place. Some were leaning on one another, others were embracing, while some were propped up by rifles or clutching submachine guns. Many had limbs severed, a grim result of their infantry's efforts to remove frozen boots from German soldiers' bodies by cutting them off so they could be warmed in the bunkers. Grishechkin, his orderly, rummaged through the pockets of the frozen soldiers and came across 2 cigarette lighters and several packs of cigarettes. The girl observed this with indifference, having witnessed such horrors numerous times before, while he was overwhelmed with dread. Tanks that had collided stood awkwardly on their hind legs, and it was terrifying to contemplate the wounded, both Russian and German, freezing to death. The front lines had moved forward, leaving these men unburied. The plight of civilians was even more severe, caught between the brutality of the Germans and the harsh actions of their own Red Army and partisans, who were instructed by Stalin to destroy any buildings that might provide shelter to the Germans. In newly liberated areas, troops of the NKVD arrested peasants suspected of collaboration with the Germans. In January alone, nearly 1,400 individuals were taken into custody, despite the blurry line between surviving and collaborating. As Soviet forces advanced, they discovered gallows and heard from villagers about other German atrocities, but in certain instances, German soldiers had shown mercy. It was often better for villagers to remain silent to avoid accusations of treason against the motherland. Stalin clung to his misguided belief that the German army would meet the same fate as Napoleon's Grand Army until April, by which time Soviet casualties had surpassed 1 million, with half being dead or missing. With the movement of troops and military supplies prioritized, the population of Moscow was on the brink of starvation. A black market emerged where clothing and shoes were traded for potatoes. Elderly individuals recalled the years of hunger experienced during the Civil War. Children faced the effects of rickets. There was a shortage of fuel and wood for heating, causing water and sewage pipes to freeze. 100,000 women and children ventured into the nearby forests to gather firewood. Electricity was scarce, leading to frequent blackouts. The number of deaths from tuberculosis doubled compared to the previous year, and overall mortality rates tripled. Although there were concerns about a typhus outbreak, dedicated efforts by medical authorities in Moscow managed to prevent it. Conditions in besieged Leningrad were far worse. German artillery bombarded the city regularly, striking 4 times a day. Nevertheless, the defenses held, largely due to the naval guns, both those on ships of the Baltic Fleet and those dismounted at the Kronstadt naval base and stationed in the Neva. The city's survival depended on its fragile link to the east. The Soviet authorities made significant yet often ineffective attempts to maintain this tenuous connection. With Germans occupying the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, the only accessible route was by the ice road. The ice thickened enough to support motor and horse-drawn vehicles only after the 3rd week of November, at a time when the city's supplies dwindled to just 2 days. A sudden thaw posed a great risk. On the eastern front, Germans captured Tikhvin on November 8th. This compelled the Soviets to construct a corduroy road using felled birch trees through the northern forests. Thousands of forced laborers, peasants, Gulag prisoners, and rear troops perished during this endeavor, and their remains were discarded into the mud beneath the wooden path. Unfortunately, these sacrificial efforts proved nearly futile as Merezkov's troops, supported by partisans attacking the German rear, retook Tikhvin on December 9th, just 3 days after the completion of the corduroy road. This victory reopened the railhead and significantly shortened the journey to the southeastern area of Lake Ladoga. The 2-way traffic across the frozen lake, transporting factory machinery east and supplies west, was a remarkable achievement. The ice road was defended against assaults from German ski troops with machine gun positions and anti-aircraft artillery located at strong points on the ice, complete with igloos for Red Army soldiers to seek refuge in. The Soviets created armed aerosleighs driven by aircraft engines, featuring propellers at the rear, resembling a winter version of swamp gliders. Medical centers and staffed control points were established across the ice to manage traffic. However, the treatment of civilian evacuees from Leningrad displayed a harsh lack of ability and creativity. Even the secret police voiced their concerns over the uncaring and cruel treatment, as well as the inhumane conditions on the trains. Those who made it to the mainland faced abandonment, relying on family or friends for food and shelter. After Tikhvin was retaken, residents of Leningrad were so weakened by hunger that many collapsed on the icy streets while desperately searching for fuel or food. Their ration books were often stolen, and bread was snatched from those returning from the bakery. Nothing undermines basic morality faster than hunger. When a family member passed away, the body was sometimes concealed in the freezing apartment to continue claiming rations. Despite the authorities' concerns, few dared to raid or loot bakeries. Only party leaders and those connected to the distribution of food truly possessed the strength. Those not working in factories where access to subsidized canteens was available faced near certain death. They aged so quickly that even close relatives might struggle to recognize them. First, crows, pigeons, and seagulls were consumed, followed by cats and dogs, including the well-known experimental dogs from Pavlov's research facility, and ultimately rats. Almost everyone attempting to walk to work or wait in line for food had to pause frequently due to weakness. Children's sleds initially used for firewood were later repurposed to transport corpses, referred to as mummies, because they were wrapped in paper or cloth shrouds, destined for mass graves. Wood was too precious for coffins, as it was essential for heating to survive. Out of a population of 2,280,000 in December 1941, only 514,000 were evacuated to the mainland by spring, while 620,000 lost their lives. For the older generation, this blockade marked the second significant famine they had faced, the first occurring in 1918 during the Civil War. Many noted they sensed death approaching roughly 48 hours before passing away. Many individuals, using their last bit of strength, reported to work just to inform their employers that they would not be returning and implored them to care for their families. Leningrad, known for its cultural legacy, converted the Astoria Hotel into a hospital for writers and artists. Here, they were given vitamins in the form of a bitter drink made from crushed fresh pine needles. Efforts were also made to support orphans, with a head teacher noting how the children had lost their youthful appearance, becoming eerily quiet with a focused look in their eyes. Unfortunately, in some facilities, kitchen staff stole food intended for the children to feed their own families, leaving the orphans to suffer from hunger. The city's authorities did not adequately prepare by stocking firewood before the siege, forcing many residents to burn books and broken furniture in their stoves to stay warm. Old wooden structures were dismantled to supply fuel for public buildings. In January 1942, Leningrad experienced temperatures that sometimes plunged below -40 degrees. Many people simply stayed in bed to find warmth, but they eventually wasted away. Death from starvation came quietly and without notice, transitioning from a diminished existence to nothingness. A woman recounted to a British journalist later how it was often necessary to step over corpses on the streets and staircases, leading to a numbness to the suffering around them. Most victims succumbed to a combination of hunger and cold. The harsh conditions of hypothermia and stress disrupted their body's ability to absorb the little nutrition they did manage to consume. Although soldiers were theoretically promised better food rations than civilians, many did not receive them as officers took them for themselves and their families. A diarist observed the transformation of people into savages. Some individuals lost their sanity due to starvation. Despite claims in Soviet history denying acts of cannibalism, both testimony and historical records tell a different story. During the siege, about 2,000 individuals were arrested for consuming human flesh, with 886 arrests occurring during the harsh winter of 1941 to 1942. The term corpse eating referred to consuming meat from the deceased. Disturbingly, some people resorted to taking bodies from morgues or mass graves. Outside Leningrad, A number of soldiers and officers turned to eating corpses or even the amputated limbs from field hospitals. Cannibalism, particularly in the form of person eating, was a rare but horrifying act involving the intentional murder of someone for the sake of consuming their flesh. Naturally, parents kept their children close, anxious about their safety. There were chilling claims that children's flesh and that of young women was considered the most desirable. Despite numerous tales of gangs selling ground human meat disguised as kotleta or rissoles, much of the cannibalism occurred within apartment buildings, where deranged parents resorted to harming their own children or neighbors, took advantage of others' vulnerabilities. Some starving soldiers from the 56th Rifle Division of the 55th Army ambushed carriers of rations, killed them, buried the bodies in the snow, and returned later to feast on them piece by piece. However, amid this bleakness, there were moments of selfless kindness, with acts of generosity shown toward neighbors and even strangers. Remarkably, children seemed to survive better than their parents, likely due to adults sharing part of their rations. Women tended to live longer than men, but often faced collapse at a later stage. They confronted the agonizing choice of whether to heed their children's pleas or to eat enough to maintain their strength for their families. The birth rate fell sharply, partly due to severe malnutrition that led to women stopping menstruation and men's infertility, compounded by many men being away at the front. Red Army soldiers and Marine infantry in Leningrad grew increasingly convinced that the Germans would never succeed in breaking through. They believed the Germans' persistence in the siege was meant to keep Finland engaged in the conflict. Leningrad residents felt fury that the Western Allies were hesitant to view Finland as an adversary. They struggled to comprehend how Stalin's attack on Finland in 1939 could have been entirely unprovoked. The Red Army's propaganda stoked animosity toward the enemy, with posters depicting a wide-eyed child against a backdrop of a burning village, crying out, "Daddy, kill a German!" Stalin's general offensive was not the sole military campaign in early 1942. On January 21st, General Oberst Rommel caught the British in North Africa off guard. With his supply situation showing signs of improvement, the ambitious Rommel had been strategizing for another offensive. The reinforcement efforts in the Mediterranean depended on a swift takeover of the Soviet Union, yet the setback of Operation Typhoon against Moscow did not deter the plan. When a convoy arrived in Tripoli on January 5th with 55 tanks, along with armored cars and anti-tank weapons, his resolve to counterattack intensified while he held a temporary advantage. The 8th Army was struggling. The 7th Armored Division, which was in the process of rearming in Cairo, had been swapped for the inexperienced 1st Armored Division. Other seasoned units, including the Australians, had been dispatched to the Far East. The Germans had a clear understanding of the British military structure, thanks to intercepted communications from the American military attaché in Cairo, whose codes they had easily cracked. However, Rommel, who entertained grand ambitions of advancing through Egypt and the Middle East, did not share his plans with either the Italian High Command or the German High Command. Most of his troops, nonetheless, were excited to be on the offensive once again. A soldier from the 15th Panzer Division wrote home on January 23rd expressing enthusiasm. "Once again we are Rommeling ahead." As Rommel launched his counter-offensive into Cyrenaica on January 21st, he disregarded all orders to stop. One unit progressed along the coastal road toward Benghazi, while the 2 tank divisions moved inland. The tanks faced significant challenges, yet in 5 days of conflict, the British lost nearly 250 armored vehicles. Hitler was overjoyed and promoted Rommel to General of Armored Troops. The unfortunate and over-promoted General Ritchie, who believed this was merely a raid, quickly realized his 1st Armored Division was at risk of being surrounded. Fortunately for the British, Rommel's excessive ambition and the slow progress of the 2 tank divisions allowed most of their forces to retreat in time. Ritchie withdrew all of them to the Gazala line, forsaking much of Cyrenaica. Rommel's weary and fuel-deprived troops chose not to pursue. They were confident they could deal with them later. German soldiers sent to the Mediterranean as reinforcements were excited and proud to join the small Afrika Korps in the desert. A medical non-commissioned officer viewed favorably the colonizing work of the Italians in Tripoli. Also, the Italian warships escorting our convoy were impressive, he wrote home. However, many first impressions would soon fade. Out in the Libyan desert, they encountered always the same scenery, sand and stone. The conflict in North Africa was distinctly different from that in Russia, he insisted. However, the soldiers there also experienced homesickness, as someone played the harmonica at night beneath the stars, reminding them of the upcoming spring back home in Germany.